For a long time, I believed I was living the kind of life most people dream about. My name's Mark, and over the last 20 years, I've worked my way from nothing to owning a business that put us firmly in the successful family category. It wasn't always easy. There were long nights, months when I didn't know if I could pay the bills, and plenty of missed dinners while I chased every opportunity one could. But eventually, I made it. I used to joke that my business was my first child, and Vanessa, my wife of 19 years, was my biggest cheerleader. She was the type of woman who turned heads, tall, elegant, and with this effortless charm that made everyone want to be her friend. I was proud to have her by my side. And then there was Emily, our daughter. She's 18 now, just about to start college, and I couldn't be prouder of the young woman she's become. She's smart, ambitious, and has a sharp sense of humor that always keeps me grounded. "Dad, you're a workaholic," she'd tease, but I knew she said it with love. We lived in a house I used to think was too big for us when we first bought it, but over the years it became home. The kind of place you'd see in a real estate brochure: modern, open floor plans, perfectly landscaped yard, and a driveway that just got an upgrade of its own. A few months ago, I had it redone with sleek pavers because Vanessa mentioned she thought it would look classier. It was in that driveway where my pride and joy sat, a pristine white Tesla. Ironically, it wasn't even my idea to buy the car. Vanessa had planted the seed months before my birthday. "You deserve it," she said, her tone dripping with encouragement. "You've worked so hard for this family. This car is like a symbol of all your success." I'll admit I liked the idea of treating myself. The Tesla was sleek, futuristic, and honestly a bit of a flex. Emily loved it too. I'll never forget her reaction when she saw it parked in the driveway for the first time. "This is so cool, Dad," she'd said, practically bouncing with excitement. At the time, everything felt perfect. Sure, Vanessa had been busier lately. More late nights at community meetings, more weekend trips for fundraising events. But I didn't think much of it. In fact, I was proud of her. She wasn't just sitting at home spending my money. She was out there, making a difference. At least that's what I told myself. But lately, there were cracks in the picture-perfect image. Little things I couldn't ignore anymore, like how she always seemed to be on her phone, smiling at messages she never shared with me, or how she'd spend an hour getting ready to leave for those meetings, looking more like she was heading to a gala than a planning session. One night, I stayed up late working on some paperwork, and Vanessa came home well past midnight. She walked in, barely glancing at me as she muttered, "Long night. I'm exhausted," before disappearing upstairs. I didn't say anything at the time, but Emily noticed. She always noticed. "You okay, Dad?" she asked me the next morning, catching me staring out the window while sipping my coffee. The Tesla gleamed in the driveway, sunlight bouncing off its polished surface. "Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about everything we've built." She tilted her head, studying me with that look only a teenager could master. "You're working too hard. You need a break." I laughed. "What kind of break do you suggest? Maybe a trip? Somewhere warm?" She grinned. "Or you could finally take a day off and teach me to drive the Tesla." I chuckled and ruffled her hair. "Maybe I will. But only if you promise not to scratch it." The truth was, I didn't need a break. What I needed was to stop pretending that everything was fine. Vanessa's distance wasn't my imagination. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the feeling was like a pebble in my shoe. Small but impossible to forget. I just didn't know what I was walking into yet. I can't say exactly when it started, but Vanessa's behavior had shifted. Subtly at first, like a shadow you don't notice until it's already over your shoulder. She was always busy these days. Meetings, charity events, and now weekend trips that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. One evening, she walked into the kitchen as I sat at the dining table with my laptop, trying to untangle the mess of paperwork from work. She was dressed to the nines. Fitted black dress, her hair styled in soft waves, and just the right amount of makeup. "Big night?" I asked, not looking up from my screen. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Just another meeting for the community fundraiser. You know how it is." except I didn't know how it was. Vanessa hadn't been this involved in community projects for most of our marriage. Sure, she'd done some volunteering here and there, but this level of commitment was new and suspiciously timed. "Don't wait up for me," she added as she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. "It might go late." I glanced up at her, my brow furrowing. "You sure everything's okay?" She stopped, her hand hovering on the doorknob. "Of course," she said with a smile that felt too rehearsed. Why wouldn't it be? I didn't press her, but my gut told me something wasn't right. Later that night, after Vanessa left, Emily wandered into the kitchen in her pajamas, a bowl of cereal in hand. "Mom gone again?" she asked, sitting across from me at the table. "Yeah. Another meeting," I said, not bothering to hide my irritation. Emily raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Weird. She's never been this busy before." I nodded, but didn't say more. Emily was sharp. She'd picked up on the same changes I had, though I wasn't sure how much she understood. The next morning, I found myself staring at her side of the bed, which hadn't been slept in. Vanessa had come home so late that I hadn't even heard her, and when I went downstairs, she was already gone. That same day, something else happened that stuck with me. While walking out to the Tesla, I noticed her phone charger still plugged into the outlet by the couch. Vanessa never forgot her charger. She was glued to her phone more than anyone I knew. On a hunch, I checked the Tesla's console for its recent GPS history. It wasn't something I'd ever thought to do before, but something about her behavior made me curious. Most of the destinations made sense. Grocery stores, her usual yoga studio, a cafe she liked. But one address stood out. A location I didn't recognize, about 30 minutes away. I jotted it down and closed the car door, my thoughts spinning. That Tesla had once been a point of pride for me, a symbol of the life I had built through years of hard work and sacrifice. When Vanessa first suggested getting it for my birthday, I'd hesitated. Felt excessive, indulgent even. But she had been so persistent, insisting I deserved something nice for myself. "You never spoil yourself," she'd said, standing in the dealership with that radiant smile of hers. "This car is like a trophy for all you've accomplished." It sounded like a good idea at the time, and truth be told, I loved that car. There was something satisfying about the smooth hum of the electric engine, the way it felt like driving a piece of the future. But lately, I'd started to think of the Tesla differently. Every time I looked at it now, I couldn't help but wonder if it had been for me or for her. Emily loved the car, though. She was always begging me to let her drive it. "Come on, Dad," she'd say, flashing me her most persuasive grin. "It's not like I'll crash it." "Not yet," I tease. "Maybe after a few more lessons." It was one of the few things that still brought me joy, seeing her so excited about something as simple as a car. But that joy was starting to feel overshadowed by other thoughts, like the way Vanessa always seemed to have the car these days, even though I was the one who technically owned it. There was one particular afternoon that stuck with me. I had planned to use the Tesla for a client meeting, but when I went outside, it wasn't in the driveway. I called Vanessa, trying to sound casual. "Hey, did you take the car?" "Oh yeah," she replied, her tone light. "I had a meeting across town. I'll be back before dinner." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. Maybe it was the way she laughed, like she was sharing a joke I wasn't in on. That night, when she came home, I asked how her meeting went. She barely looked at me as she answered, "Fine, just the usual stuff." And that was it. No details, no follow-up, just a vague dismissal that left me feeling more uneasy than before. It didn't help that Emily had started noticing things too. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, she turned to me and said, "Mom's been weird lately, huh?" "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. "I don't know," she said, shrugging. "It's like she's distracted, and she's always on her phone." I didn't know what to say to that. Emily had always been perceptive, but I didn't want her worrying about things she didn't need to. "She's just busy," I said finally. "You know how your mom gets when she's got a project." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The Tesla was still sitting in the driveway the next morning, its white paint gleaming in the sunlight. It looked perfect, untouched. But every time I saw it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was hiding something. Like it was a silent witness to a story I hadn't been told yet. I wasn't looking for it. I think that's what hit me the hardest. It wasn't like I was snooping or trying to dig up dirt. The receipt practically fell into my lap. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and going through some papers Vanessa had left on the counter. Most of it was junk, flyers for fundraisers, a grocery list, and an envelope with some business receipts. I wasn't planning to go through them, but as I stacked everything into a neat pile, one receipt slipped out and landed on the table. I glanced at it without thinking. Then I froze. It was from a restaurant, Le Jardin, one of those upscale French places that charge $40 for a side salad. The date on the receipt caught my attention first. It was from last Thursday, one of the nights Vanessa had told me she'd been at a meeting. But it wasn't just the date. The total on the receipt was over $200, and the items listed, 2 entrees, wine, and dessert, made it clear this wasn't a solo meal. I stared at it for a long time, my coffee growing cold in my hands. A part of me wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she'd gone with a friend, or maybe it was for a work thing. But deep down, I already knew. When Vanessa came downstairs later that morning, I felt like I was seeing her in a new light. She was dressed casually, jeans and a sweatshirt, but I couldn't shake the image of her sitting at Le Jardin, sipping wine with someone else. "Morning," she said, grabbing a mug from the cupboard. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. She didn't seem to notice anything was off. She poured herself a cup of coffee and started scrolling through her phone, completely oblivious to the receipt now tucked into my pocket. Later that day, I found myself sitting in the living room with Emily. She was sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through her own phone, when she looked up at me. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "Yeah," I said automatically, but the words felt hollow. She gave me that look again, the one that said she could see right through me. "Something's up. What is it?" I hesitated. I didn't want to drag her into this. But Emily was persistent, and before I knew it, I was telling her about the receipt. Her reaction was immediate. "What? That doesn't make any sense. Who would Mom be having dinner with?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's not adding up." Emily sat up straighter, her expression serious. "Do you think could she be cheating?" The word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I couldn't deny the possibility anymore. "I don't know," I said again, my voice quieter this time. "But I need to figure it out." Emily nodded, her jaw set in determination. "If you need help, I'm here," she said firmly. Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this. That receipt was like a pebble dropped into a pond. It sent ripples through everything I thought I knew. But a receipt wasn't enough to jump to conclusions. I needed more. That evening, after Vanessa had gone upstairs to bed, I sat in the living room with my laptop and a notebook. The address I'd seen on the Tesla's GPS logs kept running through my head. I pulled up a map and typed it in. It was a residential area in a part of town we didn't frequent. Nice houses, but nothing out of the ordinary. Why would she go there so often? I wrote the address down, underlining it twice as if that would make the answer come to me. The next day, I decided to test something. Vanessa mentioned she'd be out late again for another meeting. This time, I waited until she left, then checked the Tesla's GPS once more. Sure enough, the car had been programmed to navigate to that same address. It wasn't until the third time I saw it on the logs that I decided I had to go there myself. "Emily, I'll be back in a bit," I said one evening, grabbing my jacket. "Where are you going?" she asked, looking up from her homework. "Just out for a drive," I said, trying to sound casual. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press me. I drove slowly past the house, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a nice place. 2 stories, well-kept yard, and a black SUV parked in the driveway. The lights inside were on, and I could see shadows moving through the curtains. I parked a block away and sat there for what felt like an eternity, watching. At one point, I saw Vanessa's silhouette through the window, laughing at something. My stomach twisted, and for a second, I thought I might be sick. When I got back home, Emily was waiting for me. "Where'd you go?" she asked again, this time more insistent. I hesitated, then decided to tell her the truth. "I think your mom's hiding something," I said carefully. Emily's face fell, but she nodded. "I figured," she said quietly. "She's been weird lately." I told her about the GPS logs, the receipt, and the house. She listened intently, her expression a mix of sadness and anger. "What are you going to do?" she asked when I was done. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I need to be sure before I say anything." Emily looked at me for a long moment before saying, "I'll help you." Her offer surprised me. "You don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "If she's lying to us, we deserve to know." It wasn't the kind of situation I ever wanted my daughter to be involved in, but I couldn't deny that having her support meant everything to me. Together, we started piecing things together, checking the Tesla's logs, paying closer attention to Vanessa's behavior, and even doing some light internet sleuthing about the address. Little by little, the picture started to come into focus. And the more we uncovered, the more it became clear. Whatever Vanessa was hiding, it wasn't innocent. It wasn't the first time I'd used the Tesla's GPS to check where it had been. But the more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. The address kept popping up like a beacon, taunting me every time I saw it. By now, I'd memorized the location. It was etched into my mind. Every digit a reminder of the questions I didn't yet have answers to. The worst part was how Vanessa acted like nothing was out of the ordinary. Coming home late, brushing off my questions with vague excuses, and going about her day as if everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. One night, after she'd left for another meeting, I decided to follow the GPS in real time. It felt like something out of a spy movie, and I hated that it had come to this. I just needed to see it for myself. I climbed into the Tesla, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the wheel. The route popped up on the screen as soon as I typed in the address. I started driving, my mind racing with every possibility. The streets were quiet, the orange glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the road. I kept checking the GPS, watching as the distance to the destination shrank. 10 miles. 5. 2. When I turned onto the street, my chest tightened. There it was, the house I'd driven past before. Only this time, Vanessa's car was parked out front. I pulled over a few houses away and turned off the engine. Sitting there in the dark, I watched the house with a mix of dread and anger. The lights were on, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. What was she doing in there? Who was she with? I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. Instead, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the house like it held all the answers I didn't want to hear. I stayed for nearly an hour before finally driving home. When I got back, Emily was waiting for me, her arms crossed and her face full of worry. "Did you go to the house?" she asked. I nodded, sinking into the couch. "Her car was there," I said quietly. Emily sat down beside me, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. "So, what now?" I didn't have an answer. For the first time in my life, I felt completely lost. Over the next few days, the GPS became my lifeline. I checked it constantly, tracking every trip Vanessa made. Every time I saw that address, it felt like another piece of my world falling apart. One evening, Emily and I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the logs I'd printed out. "She's been there so many times," Emily said, shaking her head. "How does she think she's getting away with this?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to confront Vanessa right then and there, to demand an explanation. But another part of me wanted to wait, to gather more evidence before making my move. "We'll figure it out," I said finally, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, her or myself. That night, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the faint patterns on the carpet, my thoughts racing. Vanessa was downstairs, laughing softly at something on her phone. The sound made my stomach turn. I thought about confronting her 100 different ways. In my head, I played out every possible scenario. Maybe I'd lay all the evidence on the table, the GPS logs, the receipt, and the countless excuses that no longer held water. Maybe I'd catch her in a lie and watch her face as the truth hit. But every time I imagined it, I felt the same knot of hesitation. What if I was wrong? What if there was an explanation, something I hadn't considered? What if confronting her made everything worse? Dad! Emily's voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, her face full of concern. What's going on? I shook my head. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly. She stepped into the room and sat down beside me. You have to talk to her, she said quietly. You can't keep doing this to yourself. I nodded, but the words felt heavy. I will, I promised. Just not tonight. Emily didn't push me, but her silence spoke volumes. She knew as well as I did that I was stalling. That night, I stayed up late, sitting in the dark living room with a glass of water I didn't touch. I could hear Vanessa moving around upstairs, her footsteps light and deliberate. Eventually, the house went quiet, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I thought about the first time I'd met Vanessa, how she'd lit up the room with her smile, how she'd made me feel like the luckiest man in the world. I thought about all the moments we'd shared, the life we'd built together. And then I thought about the house, the receipt, the laughter I'd seen through the curtains. By the time I finally went to bed, the sun was beginning to rise. Vanessa was already asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to figure out what to say, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know what I expected to find that night, but I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. It was late, the streets mostly empty. As I parked a block away from the house I'd come to recognize all too well. The soft glow of the living room lights spilled through the curtains, and the sound of faint laughter carried through the still night air. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I stared at the house. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, trying to summon the courage to do something. Anything. After what felt like an eternity, I saw her. Vanessa. She appeared in the window, her silhouette unmistakable. She was smiling, laughing at something someone had said, and then he stepped into view. A man I'd never seen before, casually dressed but with an air of confidence that made my stomach turn. He was holding a glass of wine, gesturing animatedly as Vanessa watched him with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. It wasn't just the way she looked at him, it was the way she didn't look at me anymore. I felt a rush of anger and hurt, my pulse pounding in my ears. But even as I sat there, part of me still hoped there was some innocent explanation, some reason for all of this that didn't involve betrayal. And then I saw them. Vanessa and the man moved closer together, their laughter subsiding into a quiet moment of connection. She placed her hand on his arm, and he leaned in just slightly, intimate, familiar, like they'd done this 100 times before. That was it. I felt the air leave my lungs as the reality sank in. There was no denying it now. Whatever was going on between them, it wasn't innocent. For a moment I thought about confronting them right then and there. I could storm up to the house, demand answers, and force the truth into the open. But as much as I wanted to, I couldn't bring myself to move. Instead, I started the car and drove away. When I got home, Emily was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop. She looked up as I walked in, her face full of questions she didn't need to ask. Well, she said quietly. I sank into the chair across from her, running a hand through my hair. She's seeing someone, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. I knew it, she said, her voice trembling with anger. I knew something was going on. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the discovery settling over us. It wasn't just about Vanessa anymore. It was about the life we'd built together, the trust we'd shared, and the cracks that were now too wide to ignore. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just my battle to fight. Emily had been pulled into it too, and she deserved answers just as much as I did. I couldn't take it anymore. That evening, after pacing the living room for what felt like hours, I picked up my phone and dialed Vanessa. She answered on the third ring, her voice light and casual, as if everything was fine. "Hey Mark, what's up?" "I know, Vanessa," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to confirm that she knew exactly what I was talking about. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said finally, her tone defensive. "I know about the house. I know about the man you've been seeing," I said, my voice rising. "Stop lying to me." Another pause, this one heavier. When she spoke again, her voice was colder. "Mark, I don't have time for this. I'm not doing this over the phone." Before I could respond, she hung up. I tried calling her back, but she didn't answer. By midnight, she still wasn't home. I sat in the living room, staring at the clock and waiting, but she never walked through the door. The next morning, she still wasn't back. Emily came downstairs, rubbing her eyes, and immediately noticed the tension in the room. "Where's Mom?" she asked, looking around. "She didn't come home last night," I said flatly. Emily frowned, her concern quickly turning into anger. "She's with him, isn't she?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Later that day, the papers arrived. Delivered by a courier, the envelope felt heavier than it should have. Divorce papers. Vanessa hadn't come home to face me. Instead, she'd chosen to send a legal declaration of war. When Vanessa finally showed up to face me, it wasn't at home. It was in the courtroom. She entered with her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man whose confidence was palpable. Vanessa looked the part too, polished, poised, and every bit the image of someone ready to play the role of the wronged wife. Her legal strategy became clear almost immediately. Her lawyer painted me as distant, controlling, and emotionally neglectful. They leaned heavily on the idea that my work had always come first, that I'd left her to shoulder the emotional burden of our family alone. "She's lying," Emily hissed under her breath, gripping my arm as the lawyer laid out their case. I didn't need Emily to tell me that. I knew it was all a carefully crafted story, one that twisted the truth just enough to be believable. Vanessa even brought up a bruise on her arm, claiming it was the result of my aggressive outbursts. That was the moment I felt the tide turning against me. There was no evidence to support her claims, but I could see the way the judge frowned, the way a seed of doubt had been planted. "She's just trying to get sympathy," Emily whispered. I nodded, but the damage was done. For the first time, I felt like I might actually lose everything. Not just the house and the money, but my reputation, my dignity, and the life I'd worked so hard to build. The hardest part was watching Vanessa play her role so effortlessly. She shed a tear at the perfect moment, her voice cracking as she described how I'd made her feel small and ignored her needs. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, everyone hanging on her every word. I glanced at Emily, who was visibly trembling with anger. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice calm. I explained how I'd built my business to provide for our family, how I'd always tried to support Vanessa's interests and give her the life she wanted. But I could feel the weight of her accusations pressing down on me, and I knew it wasn't enough to just defend myself. Later that evening, back at home, Emily sat across from me at the kitchen table. "We need to fight back," she said firmly. I looked at her, exhausted but grateful for her determination. "We will," I promised. "We just need to find the right way." That night, Emily and I sat at the dining table, surrounded by stacks of papers and my laptop glowing softly between us. It felt like we were investigators piecing together a crime, and in many ways we were. "I think this guy has a pattern," Emily said, scrolling through her phone. She had been researching Vanessa's lover online for hours, her frustration bubbling over with every discovery. "What kind of pattern?" I asked, leaning closer. "He's been in relationships with other women before," she said, showing me a thread on a local forum. "Look at this, 3 years ago he was involved in a messy divorce case with another woman. She lost everything because of him." I took the phone from her and read through the posts. It was all there. Details about his charm, how he manipulated the situation, and how he had a knack for disappearing when things got too complicated. "He's a predator," Emily said bitterly. "He finds women in stable marriages, tears everything apart, and moves on to the next one. The more we dug, the more obvious it became. Vanessa wasn't his first target, and she probably wouldn't be his last. That's how he gets away with it, I muttered. He lets them take the fall while he walks away clean. Emily nodded. We have to use this, she said, her voice firm. I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I printed out articles, testimonies, and court records from his previous cases. Every document painted a clearer picture of who this man really was, and it wasn't the charming, trustworthy figure Vanessa seemed to think he was. When I finally presented the evidence to my lawyer, he leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows raised. This changes everything, he said. If we can prove a pattern of manipulation, it'll destroy her case. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about exposing the truth, not just to the court but to Vanessa herself. She needed to see the man she'd thrown everything away for, the one she thought would save her from the life we'd built together. The next time we were in court, my lawyer presented the evidence with precision. He laid out the details of the lovers' past, highlighting the eerily similar patterns of behavior in each case. Vanessa's lawyer looked flustered, and for the first time, Vanessa herself seemed shaken. She kept glancing at her lover, who sat stone-faced in the gallery. This is who you've chosen to align yourself with, my lawyer said, his voice steady and firm. A man who has made a career out of destroying families for his own gain. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. Emily's idea took me completely by surprise. We were sitting in the living room, surrounded by papers and laptops, going over everything we had on Vanessa and her lover. The courtroom revelations had shaken her, but Vanessa hadn't backed down. She clung to her story, still painting herself as the victim, and I could see it was wearing on Emily just as much as it was on me. I want a DNA test, Emily suddenly said, breaking the silence. I blinked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. A DNA test? Why? She hesitated, looking down at her hands. I've been thinking about it for a while, she admitted. Mom's been acting weird for so long, and, I don't know, Dad. Something doesn't add up. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd never even entertained the idea before. Emily was my daughter, my little girl. I had never doubted that, not for a second in 18 years. You don't have to do this, I said gently, trying to steady my voice. You're my daughter, Emily. Nothing will ever change that. I know, she said, her voice trembling. But I need to know. And if it helps your case, then it's worth it. The determination in her eyes was unmistakable, and although it hurt to see her wrestle with this decision, I couldn't argue. If this was what she needed to find peace, and maybe even help us fight back, I wasn't going to stand in her way. The next day, she ordered a test kit. When it arrived a week later, she sat at her desk, staring at the small white box like it held the answers to everything. Are you sure about this? I asked, leaning against her doorway. She nodded. Yes, I need to do this. I stayed with her as she opened the kit, watching her carefully follow the instructions and seal the sample. It was a straightforward process, but the emotional toll it took on both of us was anything but simple. I'll send it tomorrow, she said quietly, placing the sealed envelope on her desk. I nodded, walking over to give her a hug. Whatever you want, Emily. But just so you know, you've always been Daddy's girl. You don't need a DNA test to prove that. She gave me a small smile, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I know, she whispered, but I still need to know. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. No matter what the test revealed, Emily was my daughter. She always would be. But the doubt Vanessa had planted in her, whether intentional or not, was something I couldn't undo. And now we both had to wait for an answer that could change everything. The courtroom was silent as Emily took the stand. Vanessa sat across the room, her composure icy and unreadable, but I could see the tension in her posture. Her lawyer was fidgeting with his papers, glancing nervously between Emily and the judge. Emily held a folded piece of paper in her hands, the weight of its contents evident in her trembling fingers. She'd insisted on testifying, even though I'd tried to shield her from the chaos of the trial. "This isn't just about you, Dad," she'd said the night before. "It's about the truth." Now, as she stood in the witness box, I couldn't have been prouder. The judge nodded for her to begin. Emily cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the pressure. "I want to talk about my mom," she began, glancing briefly at Vanessa before turning her focus back to the judge. "She's been lying," Emily continued, her voice gaining strength. "She's been lying about a lot of things. About my dad. About her relationship with another man. And about me." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Vanessa's lawyer stood up, ready to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Emily unfolded the paper in her hands and held it up. "This is a DNA test I took a few weeks ago," she said. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "It proves that my dad isn't my biological father." The air in the room seemed to freeze. I saw Vanessa stiffen, her carefully crafted mask slipping for the first time. "But that doesn't change anything," Emily said firmly, her gaze now locked on me. "He's my real dad. He's the one who raised me, who taught me everything, who's been there for me every step of the way. Biology doesn't matter. Love does." My throat tightened, and I had to fight back tears. The judge leaned forward, his expression serious. "And how does this relate to the case at hand?" he asked. Emily turned back to the judge. "It matters because my mom has been hiding this from him for 18 years. She built our entire family on a lie. And now she's trying to take everything from him, after everything he's done for us." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Vanessa's lawyer stood again, flustered. "This is irrelevant to the financial settlement," he argued. But my lawyer was ready. "Your Honor, this goes directly to the credibility of the plaintiff," he said. "She's been deceitful for nearly 2 decades, and now she's asking this court to reward her dishonesty." The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. "I'll allow it," he said, silencing Vanessa's lawyer. Vanessa looked pale, her calm facade shattered. She turned to her lover, who avoided her gaze. Emily stepped down from the stand, her head held high. As she walked back to her seat, she gave me a small, reassuring smile. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. The courtroom felt heavier than ever as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. Every breath seemed amplified, every rustle of paper a sharp interruption in the silence. Vanessa sat across the room, her once poised demeanor now replaced by a pale, shaken expression. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something to her, but she didn't respond. She simply stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I sat at the defendant's table with my lawyer, Emily, beside me. She gave my hand a reassuring squeeze, her strength a quiet but powerful presence. The judge cleared his throat. "After reviewing all the evidence and testimony presented in this case, it's clear that this situation is far more complex than it initially appeared." He looked directly at Vanessa. "Your history of deceit, including concealing the truth about your daughter's parentage for 18 years, calls your credibility into serious question." Vanessa's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge silenced him with a sharp look. "The plaintiff's demand for financial compensation, including $500,000 and the family home, lacks sufficient justification," the judge continued. "The defendant has demonstrated consistent financial support and dedication to his family, while the plaintiff has failed to provide evidence to substantiate her claims of neglect or mistreatment." Emily smiled slightly, her hand tightening around mine. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I kept my composure, waiting for the final decision. "The court hereby denies the plaintiff's financial demands," the judge declared, his gavel striking the desk with finality. "The defendant will retain ownership of the family home, his business assets, and will not be required to provide additional financial compensation to the plaintiff." The words hung in the air for a moment before the murmurs started. Vanessa looked stunned, her face draining of color. Her lawyer began hurriedly packing up his papers, clearly anticipating an uncomfortable conversation. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Emily turned to me, her eyes shining. "You did it, Dad," she whispered. "No," I said, shaking my head. "We did it." Across the room, Vanessa turned to her lover, her expression desperate. But he avoided her gaze, muttering something under his breath before standing and walking out of the courtroom without looking back. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. As we left the courthouse, Emily and I walked side by side. The weight of the trial, the lies, and the betrayal still lingered, but for the first time, there was light at the end of the tunnel. "Ready to go home?" I asked her, my voice lighter than it had been in weeks. She nodded, smiling. "Let's go." The sun was beginning to set as Emily and I pulled into the driveway. The house, which had once felt like a battlefield, now seemed quiet and peaceful. Emily climbed out of the Tesla, looking at me with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Feels good to be home," she said softly. "Yeah," I replied, shutting the car door behind me. "It does." For a moment we stood there in silence, taking it all in. The trial was behind us, the lies and betrayals exposed, and now it felt like we could finally move forward. "You know," I said, reaching into my pocket, "there's something I've been meaning to do." Emily raised an eyebrow as I held out the keys to the Tesla. "What's this?" she asked, her tone both surprised and amused. "It's yours," I said, smiling. "You've been asking to drive it for months. I think it's time you had a set of keys." Her eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Completely," I said. "You've earned it, Emily. You've been my rock through all of this. I don't know what I would have done without you." She took the keys, staring at them for a moment before looking back at me. "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders as we walked toward the house. "It's a new start for both of us," I said. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing that broke the silence as we reached the front door. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt hopeful. As we stepped inside, Emily turned to me. "You know, Dad," she said with a mischievous grin, "I still think you should teach me how to parallel park this thing." I laughed, shaking my head. "One lesson at a time, kiddo." The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol of everything we'd fought for. A life rebuilt on truth, trust, and the bond we shared. And as we closed the door behind us, I knew one thing for certain. The past might have been full of betrayal, but the future was ours to shape.